There comes an hour in the architecture of human trial when the architecture of logic finally shatters under its own weight. It is an hour unheralded by trumpets or dramatic catastrophes. It arrives quietly, often in the dim amber hush of late evening or in the cold, unblinking glare of 3 o'clock in the morning. A man sits at his desk or stands before a rain-streaked window, staring into a darkness that refuses to yield answers. He has examined his predicament from every conceivable angle. He has weighed the variables, charted the probabilities, consulted the counsel of mentors, and interrogated his own memory for precedent. Every intellectual tool at his disposal has been drawn, brandished, and exhausted. Yet nothing is clear. In this frozen space, a strange and unsettling paradox reveals itself. The more frantically the intellect searches for certainty, the more phantom-like and distant certainty becomes. It recedes like a mirage on a sun-baked highway, shimmering just out of reach. What he confronts is no longer a localized problem to be solved with a clever algorithm or a strategic maneuver. It is a heavy, ambient density, a quiet heaviness that settles over the chest when progress grinds to a halt, when the compass needle spins wildly without finding north, and when the familiar maps of yesterday suddenly depict a landscape that no longer exists. The air in the room feels thick, almost viscous, resistant to breath. Every thought moves through a sluggish medium, circling back upon itself in an endless, suffocating loop of analysis. He asks what went wrong, and the mind supplies a dozen conflicting theories. He asks how to fix it, and the answers curdle into doubt before they can take root. Logic, that proud instrument which built civilizations and unraveled the mechanics of the cosmos, has reached the absolute perimeter of its domain. It can map the known territory, but it is utterly blind in the mist. To stand at this precipice is to experience a profound vertigo. The instinct of the modern mind is to demand an explanation, to pause all forward motion until the fog lifts and the path is illuminated with fluorescent clarity. But the night offers no such courtesy. The fog remains, the questions multiply, and the silent observer watching from the shadows recognizes the inescapable truth of the threshold. Explanation has lost its currency. The man does not need another reason. He needs a pulse. He does not need a map for a country that has vanished. He needs the fierce, quiet strength to take one step when every instinct commands him to freeze. To understand why intellectual analysis ultimately fails in moments of profound impasse, one must deconstruct the mechanics of human reasoning through a rigorous psychological and philosophical lens. Why does the mind, when confronted with overwhelming uncertainty, double down on the very cognitive loops that trap it? Why does more thinking produce less movement? To answer this, we must apply the method of recursive thinking, peeling back the layers of human motivation until we expose the raw nerve of agency. Why does the intellect default to excessive analysis when progress stalls? Because the intellect perceives uncertainty as an existential threat. Evolutionary biology wired the human brain to equate ambiguity with danger. In ancestral times, the unknown bush might conceal a predator. Therefore, pausing to calculate, deliberate, and assess was a mechanism of survival. However, in the modern landscape of complex emotional, professional, and existential challenges, this ancient survival mechanism misfires. When a man faces a stalled career, a fractured relationship, or a profound loss of direction, his brain treats the lack of cognitive clarity as if it were a physical tiger in the brush. It demands that he solve the riddle before he is permitted to move. It whispers a seductive falsehood. If you can just figure it out completely, you will be safe. How does this demand for absolute clarity create paralysis? It creates paralysis by imposing an impossible precondition on action. By establishing complete understanding as the mandatory gatekeeper to forward motion, the mind constructs an internal barricade. Every time the man attempts to move, the internal sentry halts him with a barrage of unresolved variables. Are you sure? What if the outcome is negative? Do you have all the data? Because life is inherently complex and radically contingent, absolute clarity is a mathematical impossibility. Therefore, the precondition can never be met. The man remains trapped in an endless loop of preparation, mistaking the frantic spinning of his thoughts for meaningful progress. He is running on a psychological treadmill, expending tremendous metabolic energy, drenched in mental sweat, yet remaining fixed in the exact same spot. Why do traditional answers, explanations, rationalizations, and intellectual insights lose their efficacy at this exact junction? Because answers belong to the realm of the static. Movement belongs to the realm of the dynamic. An intellectual answer is a photograph of a running river. It captures a moment, categorizes it, and pins it to a board. But life is not a collection of pinned specimens. It is a living, flowing current. When a man is drowning in a rapid, studying a textbook on fluid dynamics will not keep his head above water. The explanation of why he is drowning does nothing to alter his buoyancy. Rationalization offers comfort to the ego, but it confers zero kinetic force. It addresses the intellect while starving the will. At the deepest philosophical level, this condition exposes the limitation of what the German existentialists termed the calculative mind. Calculative thinking operates on inputs and outputs. If A, then B. But human destiny frequently plunges us into domains where the variables are hidden, the equations are broken, and the outcomes are radically unquantifiable. In these dark seasons, relying solely on calculative thought is like trying to navigate a pitch-black ocean by examining the ripples directly beneath your boat, instead of raising your eyes to the distant, unyielding stars. The core principle here is as austere as it is liberating. Clarity is not the antecedent of motion, it is the consequence of it. The man who waits for the fog to clear before he walks will stand on the same shore for eternity. The fog does not part for those who wait, it parts for those who walk through it. Consider the historical account of master cartographer and navigator Julian Vance during the late 18th era of maritime exploration. Vance was renowned throughout the European academies for possessing the most meticulous analytical mind of his generation. His charts were masterpieces of geometry, drafting every known coastline, reef, and current with exquisite precision. In the autumn of 1784, Vance commanded the Aethelgard, a state-of-the-art exploratory vessel tasked with charting an uncharted archipelago in the northern seas, a notorious region known among sailors as the Shroud, perpetually choked by dense, impenetrable sea fogs that defied all prevailing navigational science. For 3 weeks, the Aethelgard drifted near the outer perimeter of the Shroud. Vance sat in his mahogany-lined cabin day after day, compasses spread before him, calculating barometric pressures, studying tide tables, and attempting to deduce the topography of the hidden islands through pure rational deduction. He held endless debates with his junior officers, analyzing every conceivable wind vector and hazard. Each morning, he declared that tomorrow would bring sufficient data to plot a safe, mathematically certain passage through the mist. Yet tomorrow brought only thicker fog, and with every passing day, a heavy, demoralizing inertia settled over the crew. The sailors, once eager and robust, grew sullen and heavy-spirited. They watched their commander pore over charts that yielded no new revelations. The ship remained dead in the water, its sails slack, caught in the doldrums of overcalculation. The intellectual rigor that had made Vance famous had now become an anchor of lead, holding the vessel fast to a stationary point of absolute paralysis. One evening, an aging first mate named Kalin, a veteran of 1,000 tempests who possessed no formal academy training but understood the ancient rhythm of the sea, entered Vance's cabin. He did not bring a new map or a clever formula. He simply extinguished the oil lamp on the desk, plunging the cabin into twilight, and pointed out the stern window toward the open horizon where the gray mist churned silently against the hull. "Captain," Kalin said quietly, his voice carrying the weathered timbre of old salt and enduring storms, "the ink on these charts is dry, but the sea is alive. You have measured the wind until your fingers are stiff, but you have not felt it on your face. The fog will never surrender its secrets to a man sitting in the dark with a ruler. If we wait for the sun to burn this away, our bones will feed the barnacles. We must weigh anchor and move into the gray, trusting that the keel will find what the eye cannot see." Vance looked up, startled by the blunt heresy of the suggestion. Every instinct of his disciplined academic training rebelled against it. Move without certainty? Sail blind into an uncharted labyrinth of hidden rocks? It violated every tenet of seamanship he had ever mastered. Yet, looking into the weathered eyes of the old sailor and feeling the crushing weight of the stagnant weeks pressing down upon his soul, Vance experienced the exact dissolution of reason described in the stillness of the night. He saw the trap of his own brilliance. He realized that his obsession with absolute safety was the very instrument of his destruction. The next morning, defying every calculation of his profession, Julian Vance gave the order that stunned the fleet: weigh anchor, full sail into the mist. There was no sudden revelation of sunlight. As the Aethel Guard slipped past the boundary markers and into the vast, consuming white wall of the shroud, the world vanished. The lookout in the crow's nest could barely see the bowsprit. For hours, the ship crept forward at a crawl, the timbers groaning under the unseen pressure of hidden currents. Every man on deck held his breath, expecting disaster at any second. Yet, as the ship cut steadily through the water, moving forward despite the lack of visibility, despite the absence of certainty, despite the terrifying lack of reassuring data, something extraordinary occurred. The continuous motion generated a wake, a directional current that stabilized the vessel against the erratic cross swells. And more importantly, as the ship advanced 3 leagues into the uncharted interior, the sheer density of the fog began to thin. Channels opened between towering, jagged spires of rock that no map had ever recorded. By trusting the movement rather than the map, Vance discovered not a watery grave, but a deep protected passage leading straight through the heart of the archipelago into open waters beyond. The lesson was etched permanently into the captain's log. Reason is the lantern that illuminates the room we are in, but courage is the step that carries us into the room yet unbuilt. Vance had survived, not because his mind became sharper, but because his will became heavier than his doubt. How then does a man translate this profound realization from abstract philosophy into the immediate, visceral architecture of his daily life today? When the familiar heaviness descends, when the answers you have desperately sought refuse to materialize, when your career, your project, or your spirit feels stalled in an impenetrable fog, you must execute a deliberate disruption of your internal pattern. Stop analyzing. Stop seeking the elusive 10th piece of data that you have convinced yourself will make everything clear. Recognize that your desire for absolute certainty is not a virtue of diligence. It is a symptom of fear, disguised as preparation. Take one small, uncalculated step forward. It does not need to be a monumental leap. It can be as simple as drafting the single sentence you have avoided writing, making the phone call you have postponed for weeks, or physically rising from your desk to walk into the open air. Let the action precede the motivation. Let the movement create the clarity, rather than waiting for clarity to sanction the movement. Whisper to yourself the quiet, sovereign affirmation that breaks the spell of overthinking. I do not wait for perfect answers. I move with what I know. Hold fast to that truth. For the fog is not an enemy sent to block your path. It is the testing ground designed to forge your endurance. As you begin to feel the first subtle return of momentum, the quiet friction of progress against the stillness, you will feel the structural integrity of your inner world begin to shift. The paralysis breaks, the heavy air parts, and as you stand upright on the deck of your own life, ready to face whatever lies hidden just beyond the immediate horizon, you realize that the first chapter of the storm has been crossed, not by solving the mystery, but by walking straight into its heart. Yet, the journey has only just begun, for beyond the mist lies a deeper trial, the quiet accumulation of endurance when the initial burst of motion meets the long, unchanging stretch of the open sea. Listen closely, for the horizon is shifting, and the next chapter calls you forward into the deep. There is a distinct, silent tragedy played out daily in the drawing rooms of high ambition and the sterile offices of intellectual deliberation. The tragedy of the frozen sentinel. The man of profound capacity stands at the threshold of a great endeavor, his hand resting upon the latch, yet his boots remain glued to the floorboards. Around him, the room is bathed in the soft, deceptive twilight of preparation. Books are stacked with geometric precision. Notes are cross-referenced with meticulous care. Every potential hazard has been catalogued, labeled, and filed into a mental dossier of defense. To the casual observer passing by the window, he appears to be the very embodiment of discipline, a model of deliberate, thoughtful industry. Yet beneath this veneer of industrious stillness lies a profound spiritual paralysis. He is waiting for the fog to lift completely. He is waiting for the amber light of absolute certainty to illuminate every league of the road before him, ensuring that no stone is unturned, no surprise ambushes his plans, and no shadow hides an unforeseen failure. The air in this room is stale, thick with the scent of unspent potential and old parchment. The clock on the mantelpiece ticks away the hours, its rhythmic pendulum marking not progress, but the slow, agonizing decay of momentum. Outside, the world moves in its wild, uncurated chaos. Storms break, rivers rise, seasons turn, while inside, the watcher remains suspended in amber, paralyzed by the seductive illusion that readiness is an emotion that arrives unbidden before the battle begins. He believes he is being wise. He tells himself that patience is a virtue, that caution is the shield of the prudent. But beneath these noble rationalizations hums a darker, unacknowledged fear. The terror of being wrong, the dread of moving forward with a flawed map, the absolute refusal to look foolish in the eyes of his own exacting standards. And so, while he waits for the sky to clear, the sky grows heavier, the horizon darkens, and the door beneath his hand begins to rust upon its hinges. The tragedy is not that he lacks the strength to walk. It is that he has convinced himself he must first feel completely invulnerable before he is permitted to take a single step. To dismantle the illusion of readiness, one must subject the psychology of anticipation to rigorous philosophical inquiry. Why does the human mind cling so desperately to the prerequisite of absolute clarity, and how does this psychological posture transform a virtue of caution into a vice of stagnation? Let us apply the method of recursive thinking to peel back the layers of this pervasive condition. Why does the human intellect demand the feeling of readiness before initiating action? The intellect demands readiness because it is inherently risk-averse, calibrated by millions of years of evolutionary conditioning to prioritize preservation over exploration. In the primitive theater of human survival, acting without sufficient preparation meant physical destruction. The brain remembers this ancient ledger. When a modern individual faces a profound decision, whether launching a vital enterprise, altering the trajectory of a life, or confronting an internal transformation, the brain translates the natural ambiguity of the future into a lethal threat. It whispers that if one can only think deeply enough, plan long enough, and gather enough information, the threat can be neutralized entirely. Readiness is therefore manufactured by the ego as a psychological security blanket, a soothing fiction designed to quiet the autonomic nervous system's alarm bells. How does this psychological posture actively sabotage the very outcome it seeks to guarantee? It sabotages success through a cruel paradox. The feeling of readiness does not precede action. It is exclusively generated by action. Confidence, certainty, and clarity are not atmospheric conditions that drift into the mind of a passive observer waiting on the shoreline. They are manufactured goods produced in the industrial furnace of engagement. When a man refuses to move until he feels ready, he starves his psyche of the very feedback loops required to build confidence. Without empirical friction, without the physical reality of stepping into the unknown, making a mistake, adjusting course, and surviving the impact, the mind remains starved of true data. It feeds only on its own internal anxieties, growing bloated with hypothetical catastrophizing. Thus, waiting to feel ready is like a man refusing to enter the water until he has learned how to swim while standing entirely on dry land. The prerequisite is a logical impossibility. Why do capable, intelligent individuals fall prey to this trap more frequently than the uninitiated? Because intelligence is a double-edged sword. The more intelligent a man is, the more variables he can perceive. A simple mind sees only a single path and walks it without hesitation, often stumbling, but just as often arriving. A brilliant mind, however, perceives 1,000 intersecting pathways, 1,000 potential hazards, and 1,000 nuanced failure modes. The intellectual architect can construct elaborate rationalizations for delay that sound sophisticated even to his own ears. He confuses intellectual complexity with practical wisdom. He spends his days refining the blueprint while the foundation of his life remains unpoured, mistaking the comfort of contemplation for the courage of execution. At the philosophical core of this dynamic lies the distinction between calculative waiting and existential commitment. Calculative waiting assumes that the universe is a predictable clockwork mechanism that can be fully comprehended from a posture of detachment. Existential commitment recognizes that the universe is an unfolding arena where meaning, clarity, and mastery are hammered out on the anvil of participation. The man who waits for certainty is governed by the illusion that time is an infinite resource held in reserve for his preparation. But time is an unrelenting current. It washes past whether the traveler steps into the boat or remains standing frozen on the bank. The realization that shatters this paralysis is austere. Readiness is not a feeling. It is a decision. One does not wait until the fear vanishes to act. One acts in the presence of fear, and through that courageous act, fear is systematically starved of its authority. In the annals of maritime history, few accounts illustrate the devastating cost of the wait for perfection, quite like the ill-fated expedition of the Spanish galleon San Cristobal in the late summer of 1592. Commanded by Don Alister de Mendoza, a nobleman renowned throughout the ports of Seville for his peerless intellect and his obsession with meteorological perfection, the San Cristobal was tasked with carrying a vital royal charter across an uncharted expanse of the western trade routes. Mendoza was a man who left nothing to chance. For 6 weeks, while anchored in the harbor of Cadiz, he refused to set sail. Day after day, his officers stood upon the quarterdeck, salt-sprayed and eager, watching their commander pore over astronomical charts, consult foreign tide scrolls, and debate the subtle shifts in the barometric glass. A faint easterly breeze would blow, and Mendoza would shake his head, declaring that the swell was fractionally too high, the humidity index too erratic, or the wind vector insufficiently steady to guarantee a flawless passage out of the bay. His first officer, a battle-hardened veteran named Diego who had lost 2 fingers at the Battle of Lepanto, approached Mendoza on the 7th week as the ship's timbers baked under a merciless sun. "My lord," Diego said, his voice level with restrained frustration, "the provisions are dwindling in the hold, and the crew grows restless under this endless waiting. The sea beyond the harbor is open. We have a stout ship, capable hands, and enough canvas to catch whatever wind the heavens provide. If we wait for the sky to be entirely without cloud, we shall rot at our moorings." Mendoza replied with the calm, aristocratic serenity of a man wholly convinced of his own intellectual superiority. "Diego, you confuse impatience with seamanship. A prudent captain does not test the ocean's temper when the port can offer shelter. I am waiting for the precise convergence of favorable currents and unblemished skies. When the signs are absolute, we shall depart. Until then, discipline must hold. Yet, absolute signs never arrived. Nature is not an obedient servant that aligns its cosmic machinery to suit the timid calculations of men." While Mendoza sat in his cabin drafting endless addenda to his navigation logs, a sudden unseasonal tempest swept down from the northern mountains, a fierce, roaring squall that bypassed the open sea entirely and smashed directly into the anchored harbor of Cadiz. The fury of the storm caught the San Cristobal completely unawares. Because the ship was tethered tight to the stone docks with its sails furled and its rudders locked for stationary harbor holding, it lacked the kinetic momentum required to ride out the kinetic assault. The towering wooden hull was driven violently against the stone breakwater by monstrous crosswaves. Without forward motion to give the rudder bite, the ship was entirely at the mercy of the elements. Within 3 hours, the Grand Galleon, the pride of Seville's maritime academy, designed by the finest minds and stalled by the most cautious calculations, was battered into a helpless wreck, its hull splintered against the very docks where it had waited for perfection. Mendoza survived, fished out of the churning frost by Diego, but his magnificent vessel was lost. As he stood shivering on the rain-soaked stone pier, watching the wreckage of his meticulous preparations sink beneath the dark swells, the profound irony of his fate struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had sought to avoid danger through absolute preparation, and in doing so, he had placed himself in the most vulnerable position possible. Entirely stationary, entirely unprepared for the sudden violence of an unpredictable world. Across the bay, a small, weathered fishing ketch crewed, battered, and manned by salt-crusted fishermen who possessed no academic charts and no illusions of perfection, had weighed anchor at the very first breath of the morning breeze, hours before the tempest broke. While Mendoza's pristine galleon was smashed to splinters against the stone, the humble ketch had cut deep into the open sea, riding the turbulence of the storm with hull speed and momentum, navigating the troughs through active steering, and emerging safely on the far side of the gale. The lesson was forged in salt and timber. The ship in the harbor is safe, but that is not what ships were built for. Mendoza had waited for a guarantee that the universe refuses to issue, and in his waiting, he had been destroyed by the very stillness he cultivated as a shield. How does a man break the hypnotic spell of preparation and translate this timeless principle into the concrete architecture of his daily existence today? When you recognize that you are lingering in the waiting room of your own life, when you catch yourself refining a plan for the 5th time, reading yet another book on how to begin, or telling yourself that you will start as soon as conditions are right, you must execute an immediate, uncompromising act of interruption. You must starve the illusion of readiness by forcing your foot across the invisible line of hesitation. Identify the single task, project, or confrontation you have been postponing under the guise of needing more time to think. Do not prepare another document. Do not consult another opinion. Take one tangible, irreversible physical step forward within the next hour. Send the message. Write the first paragraph without editing. Step out the door into the cold air without checking the weather. Anchor your mind in the austere reality that your first iteration does not need to be magnificent. It merely needs to exist. Whisper the foundational affirmation that strips away the requirement for pre-calculated perfection. I move forward even when the path is not fully clear. Let that sentence ring like a bell through the silent chambers of your overactive mind. Feel the sudden electric shift as the paralysis begins to crack under the weight of actual engagement. You are no longer a spectator waiting for permission from the cosmos. You are an active participant, carving your own direction out of the raw, unshaped material of the present moment. Yet, as the first ripples of momentum begin to spread across the quiet waters of your life, a new and subtle challenge emerges from the depths. For motion brings friction, and friction produces an accumulation of quiet weight. The slow, grinding resistance of sustained effort when the initial excitement fades and the long march begins. Listen closely, for the tide is turning, and the next chapter calls you forward into the heavier, enduring work of carrying the burden without breaking. There is a distinct, unheralded brand of fatigue that does not announce itself with the dramatic fanfare of a sudden catastrophe, nor does it strike with the sharp agony of an acute wound. It arrives in the silence between heartbeats, accumulating grain by grain, like fine desert sand drifting imperceptibly across a forgotten threshold. A man continues to rise with the dawn. He sits at his customary post. He fulfills his obligations with the mechanical precision of a clockwork automaton. Yet, beneath this outward veneer of unbroken discipline, something fundamental has shifted in the inner atmosphere of his being. The efforts that once yielded vibrant progress now produce a sluggish, muted resistance. The tasks that previously ignited a spark of creative fire now feel like dragging an iron anchor across dry cobblestones. It is a slow, quiet erosion of vitality, a heaviness born not from a single, catastrophic failure, but from the relentless accumulation of unanswered exertion. He notices it in the way his shoulders instinctively tighten against an invisible pressure, and in the way his gaze lingers longer on the floor than on the horizon. Every attempt to force a breakthrough meets with a dull, unyielding compliance from the universe. No sharp rebuff, no thunderous lightning strike, just a flat, gray sponge, absorbing his energy without offering any reciprocal momentum. The books on his shelves appear smaller. The air in his study feels denser, laden with the unspent echoes of past struggles. To the outside world, he is the very portrait of steadfast consistency, a pillar of reliability who never misses a step. But internally, he feels the crushing, compressive weight of a silent archive, the stack of days where effort was expended without visible return, where clarity remained elusive, and where the distance between where he stands and where he intended to be seemed to stretch rather than shrink. He has not stopped walking, but his boots feel lined with lead. He is caught in the profound, suffocating paradox of the long march, moving forward with immaculate form, while wondering quietly in the dark if the ground beneath him is sinking into the mire. To comprehend the nature of this quiet accumulation, we must subject the mechanics of sustained effort to rigorous psychological and philosophical inquiry. Why does prolonged exertion under conditions of uncertainty generate a specific form of spiritual exhaustion, and how does this weight transform from a burden of despair into a crucible of enduring strength? Let us deploy the method of recursive thinking to unpack this internal phenomenon. Why does continuous effort without immediate, visible feedback generate an internal weight? The human mind is intrinsically wired for feedback loops. In the natural order, action is designed to produce a proportional and perceptible reaction. The seed produces a sprout, the strike of the flint produces a spark, the hunt yields sustenance. When a man labors for months or years in a domain where feedback is delayed, ambiguous, or entirely absent, the psychological circuit remains open. The energy expended is not discharged. It is internalized, accumulating as cognitive and emotional friction. The brain, struggling to make sense of the discrepancy between input and output, begins to manufacture doubt. It whispers that the lack of visible progress is a symptom of fundamental error, converting neutral delay into active psychological debt. How does this accumulated friction alter the internal landscape of the individual? It alters the landscape by shifting the locus of motivation from aspiration to endurance. In the beginning of any great endeavor, a man is driven by the bright combustion of vision and excitement. But vision is a volatile fuel. It burns hot and fast, exhausted by the sheer friction of reality. When vision wanes, what remains is either collapse or endurance. The accumulated weight acts as an invisible test of sovereignty. It forces the man to confront a brutal philosophical reality. Can he continue to act when the reward has vanished from view, when applause has turned to silence, and when every muscle protests against the unchanging horizon? Why do many capable individuals misinterpret this heaviness as a sign to abandon their path? Because modern culture worships immediate velocity and visible metrics. We are conditioned to measure worth by the speed of the output and the brilliance of the milestone. When progress slows down, when the gradient steepens and the climb becomes vertical, the uninitiated mind mistakes the slowing of speed for the cessation of motion. It panics, assuming that because the landscape looks the same today as it did yesterday, the journey has failed. The individual seeks relief by stopping, mistakenly believing that rest will dissolve the weight, when in reality, stopping only allows the weight to settle permanently into the bones. At the deepest philosophical level, this phenomenon reveals the true architecture of character. As the ancient Stoics understood, ease produces fragility, while resistance produces density and resilience. The quiet weight is not an indication that the man has taken a wrong turn. It is the physical manifestation of gravity testing the integrity of his commitment. The core principle here is unyielding. The weight you feel is not a command to stop. It is the price of carrying something of true weight. The man who seeks a life devoid of heavy seasons seeks a life devoid of magnitude. One does not eliminate the burden by wishing it away. One expands the capacity of the spirit until the shoulders grow broad enough to bear it without breaking. In the remote mining province of Cumberland, during the early 19th century, there lived an aging master metalsmith named Silas Thorne, renowned throughout the northern shires for forging the finest tempered steel blades in the empire. While younger apprentices sought fame by working with soft, malleable metals that could be shaped quickly into dazzling ornamental trinkets, Silas specialized in the grueling craft of producing high-carbon siege steel metal destined to withstand the crushing impact of fortress gates and monumental pressures. The process of forging siege steel was notoriously agonizing. It required thousands of rhythmic, unbroken hammer strikes upon a single ingot of iron heated to a blinding, white-hot fury. For hours upon hours, in the deafening roar of the bellows and the blistering heat of the coal pit, Silas would strike the iron. In the autumn of 1812, Silas undertook his most demanding commission, forging the grand pivot axle for the sluice gates of the Royal Navigation Canal, a critical component that would regulate the immense water pressure of an entire river valley. The work required 3 continuous weeks of unyielding hammerwork. By the end of the second week, the physical accumulation of the labor began to take its toll. The handle of the heavy iron hammer felt as though it weighed 1,000 pounds. Each blow sent a jarring shockwave up Silas's forearms, settling deep into his joints as a dull, chronic ache. The rhythmic music of the forge began to sound less like a song and more like a monotonous heartbeat of torture. Worst of all, the iron ingot looked virtually identical to how it had looked 3 days prior, a dark, unyielding mass of metal that refused to show the dramatic transformation taking place within its molecular structure. A young apprentice named Julian, watching his master's weary frame laboring in the smoke, stepped forward with hesitation. "Master," Julian said, his voice strained above the hiss of the quenching trough, "look at your hands. Look at the steel. For days, the shape has not changed. The metal absorbs every blow and gives nothing back. We are expending our strength for naught. Perhaps the iron is flawed, or perhaps the design is impossible. Should we not set it aside and cast a smaller, lighter bar?" Silas paused. He lowered the heavy hammer to the stone floor, exhaling a long, slow breath that carried the gray dust of the forge. He looked at the boy with eyes etched deep by decades of fire and smoke. "Julian," Silas said, his voice gravelly and low, carrying the resonance of an iron bell. "You look at the surface and see only stillness. You judge the value of the blow by how much the metal leaps beneath the hammer. But steel is not shaped by the noise it makes. It is shaped by the molecular compaction happening where your eyes cannot reach. Every strike you think is wasted is actually driving the carbon deeper into the grain, knitting the fibers together into a single, unbreakable mass. If we stop now because the iron refuses to brag about its transformation, we are left with brittle slag. The weight you feel in your arms is not a sign that the work is failing. It is the sign that the metal is finally becoming strong enough to hold the weight of a world." Silas picked up the hammer, squared his shoulders, and resumed his rhythmic cadence. Clang, clang, clang. 3 days later, when the forging was complete and the steel cooled in its oil bath, the ingot was subjected to the crown's rigorous hydraulic pressure test. While a dozen lesser blades forged in haste shattered under the initial surge, Silas's pivot axle held firm against millions of gallons of rushing water, bearing the immense strain without a single fracture. It became legendary not because it was pretty, but because it had been hammered in the silence of endurance. The lesson was forged in fire and iron. Magnitude is never born of ease. It is hammered out in the quiet hours, when the effort feels heaviest and the reward is entirely out of sight. How does a man translate this profound truth into the concrete architecture of his daily life today? When the quiet heaviness settles over your spirit, when your routine feels burdensome, when your progress slows to a crawl, and when the accumulated fatigue of past struggles threatens to pin you to the floor, you must execute an intentional recalibration of your posture. Do not fight the weight. Do not waste precious energy wishing for lighter conditions or immediate relief. Acknowledge the pressure and deliberately choose to broaden your shoulders to receive it. Pause for a moment of quiet sovereignty. Remind yourself that the heaviness you feel is not an emergency. It is the evidence of your engagement with something that matters. Whisper the grounding affirmation that anchors your resolve against the pull of despair. I carry the weight, but I do not let it stop my movement. Let those words settle deep into your chest. Feel the subtle shift as resignation gives way to quiet endurance. You do not need the burden to vanish. You only need to outgrow your weakness. Take one steady, deliberate step forward under the canopy of that pressure. Maintain your cadence. Trust the unseen compaction happening within your character, even when the external world offers no applause. As you step forward, carrying your burden with renewed dignity, the dense air begins to thin. A faint, steady glow appears on the periphery of your awareness, small, fragile, yet fiercely persistent. Listen closely, for the shadows are parting, and the next chapter calls you forward into the quiet sanctuary of the inner flame. There is an hour in the dead of winter when the hearth fire has burned down to a bed of gray, suffocating ash. The room is swallowed by a deep, numbing chill. The windows are frosted with intricate, frigid ferns of ice, and the shadows stretch long and skeletal across the floorboards. To a casual observer entering the chamber, the warmth appears entirely dead. The blazing spectacle of the afternoon has vanished, replaced by a dull, uniform gloom that presses heavily against the senses. Yet, if a man kneels close to the hearth, pushes aside the heavy shroud of ash, and peers into the dark heart of the embers, he discovers a profound paradox. Beneath the gray blanket of cooled residue, hidden from the casual gaze, lies a single point of intense concentrated crimson. It does not crackle. It does not cast bright light across the rafters. It is a tiny, fragile spark, no larger than a pinprick, trembling on the razor-thin edge between extinction and survival. This is the anatomy of a faint flame. It is the precise state of the human spirit when all external validation has been stripped away, when the bright enthusiasm of early ambition has been quenched by hardship, and when the loud applause of the world has faded into absolute silence. In this desolate interior landscape, hope does not manifest as a roaring bonfire of certainty or a grand vision of triumphant conquest. It does not eliminate doubt, nor does it banish the creeping cold of despair. It merely exists as a quiet, stubborn insistence that the dark does not have the final word. Most men, walking into that freezing room, see only the gray ash and turn away, convinced that the fire is gone forever. They mistake the stillness of the spark for the death of the core. They abandon the hearth, letting the bitter frost claim the house, unaware that a kingdom of light was sleeping beneath a handful of dust. The tragedy is not that the flame was weak. It is that the man lacked the discernment to recognize its quiet majesty and the discipline to protect it from the draft. To comprehend the true mechanics of this inner spark, we must subject the nature of hope to rigorous psychological and philosophical inquiry. Why does hope, in its purest and most vital moments, appear so small, fragile, and easily overlooked, yet possess the capacity to alter the destiny of empires? Let us apply the method of recursive thinking to unpack this delicate psychological structure. Why does genuine hope initially present itself as something small, quiet, and defenseless rather than a grand, unshakable certainty? True hope is born in the crucible of adversity, and adversity strips away all artificial amplification. When a man is surrounded by absolute clarity and abundant resources, his optimism is often bloated by comfort. It is a loud, boastful confidence, fueled by favorable conditions rather than true inner strength. But when those external props are kicked away, when the plans crumble, the money vanishes, and the horizon turns black, hope is distilled down to its absolute chemical essence. It no longer relies on the architecture of circumstance. It becomes a pure, unadulterated act of the will. Because it is stripped of all worldly ornamentation, it appears small. It is a solitary ember glowing in the dark precisely because it has nothing left to burn except the raw courage of the soul. How does the human mind's cognitive bias toward catastrophe threaten this fragile spark? The human brain is an alarm system engineered to detect danger, loss, and friction. When progress stalls and uncertainty reigns, the mind's default scanning mechanism locks onto negative inputs. It magnifies every obstacle, replays every failure, and projects catastrophic futures onto the screen of consciousness. This internal climate of worry acts as a cold, wet wind blowing across the hearth. If the individual leaves his attention unguarded, this gale of pessimistic rumination will systematically cool the ember, replacing the quiet warmth of possibility with the frozen certainty of defeat. Hope is lost not because it is inherently weak, but because it is starved of attention and overwhelmed by the unmonitored chatter of fear. Why do most individuals fail to recognize that hope requires deliberate, active protection rather than passive existence? Because modern society treats emotions as passive weather patterns, things that happen to us rather than disciplines we cultivate. People wait to feel hopeful the way they wait to feel warm when the sun comes out. When the weather turns cold, they surrender to the chill. They do not understand that hope is not a passive mood. It is an active discipline of mental and spiritual husbandry. It is a garden that must be weeded of doubt, a forge that must be shielded from drafts, a sacred flame that requires the constant, intentional addition of fuel. At the philosophical core of this dynamic lies the distinction between optimism and hope. Optimism is a spectator sport. It is the comforting belief that things will turn out well because external conditions favor a happy ending. Hope, by contrast, is a warrior's virtue. It is the resolute conviction that a course of action is worth pursuing, regardless of how the external conditions turn out. Optimism requires a sunny sky. Hope requires only a dark night and a willing heart. The core principle is absolute. The size of the flame at the beginning does not determine the magnitude of the fire at the end. It is the consistency with which it is protected that dictates its triumph. The man who learns to shelter his smallest aspirations from the winds of cynicism holds within his hands the power to reignite his entire world. In the bitter winter of 1709, known across the European continent as the Great Frost, when even the salt waters of the Venetian lagoon froze solid, a solitary watchman named Thaddeus maintained the lighthouse of Isleberg, a treacherous, isolated promontory jutting into the North Sea. The winter had been unrelenting. Weeks of violent blizzards had severed all communication with the mainland. The supply boat had failed to arrive before the freeze, leaving Thaddeus isolated in the stone tower with meager rations of dried salt fish and a rapidly diminishing stock of whale oil for the great beacon lamp. For 10 days, the storm battered the tower with hurricane-force gales, howling through the masonry seams like a pack of starving wolves. The bitter cold penetrated the thick stone walls, turning the water in the pitcher to solid ice. In the lantern room at the summit of the tower, the massive copper oil reservoir was nearly empty. Only a tiny, sputtering wick remained, fed by the last few drops of rendered fat aflame no larger than the petal of a white rose, flickering desperately in the heavy draft leaking through the iron-framed glass. Thaddeus stood in the freezing darkness of the lantern room, his breath pluming in white clouds before his face, his fingers stiff and numb. He looked at the tiny, trembling flame. A voice in his mind, the cold, rational voice of despair, whispered the bleak arithmetic of his survival. The oil will be gone before midnight. The storm will rage for days. You are freezing, starving, and entirely forgotten. Why waste your remaining warmth trying to nurse a dying light? Let it go out. Sleep, and be at peace. The temptation to yield was immense. Surrender felt warm. It promised an immediate cessation of struggle, an end to the bone, deep ache of the cold. Yet something deep within Thaddeus, an ancient, stubborn ember of human resolve that refused to be extinguished by circumstances stirred to life. He remembered the merchant fleet still scattered across the black, churning waters of the Channel, navigating blind through the gale. If his light died, ships would shatter against the jagged teeth of Isleberg before dawn. Thaddeus did not curse the storm. He did not waste his breath lamenting the missing supply boat or the cruelty of the winter. He dropped to his knees before the tiny brass lamp, cupping his frostbitten hands gently around the base of the glass cylinder to shield the flame from the biting draft. With deliberate, agonizing care, he gathered scraps of dry paper from his logbook, tore them into microscopic strips, and fed them one by one into the tiny pool of oil, extending the life of the wick. He blew softly, rhythmically, warming the metal burner with his own breath. For 6 hours, through the howling peak of the blizzard, Thaddeus remained on his knees in the dark tower, guarding that single, fragile point of light. The flame dipped and danced, threatened constantly by the howling drafts, but he never moved his hands. He feted his focus. He feted his unwavering attention. He feted his refusal to die in the dark. By dawn, the wind began to subside, dropping to a low, sullen growl across the frozen cliffs. As the first pale rays of winter sunlight broke across the eastern horizon, the beacon nursed through the night by human will was still burning. Far out to sea, 2 storm-tossed merchant galleons, guided by that solitary, steadfast thread of light through the freezing mist, cleared the treacherous reef and slipped safely into the deep fjord beyond. When the rescue ships finally reached Isleberg a week later, they found Thaddeus sitting beside the massive copper lamp. The beacon was blazing with a fierce, steady roar fueled by restored provisions, casting a brilliant golden arc across the sea. The watchman was cold, exhausted, and gaunt, but his eyes burned with the quiet, unshakable fire of a man who had looked into the abyss of extinction and refused to yield his light. The lesson was forged in ice and fire. A faint flame is not a sign of defeat. It is the seed of an absolute restoration. He who protects the spark in the dark owns the dawn. How does a man translate this profound truth into the concrete architecture of his daily existence today? When the bitter winds of doubt blow through your life, when your enthusiasm has frozen, your energy has drained into gray ash, and the internal spark feels so small that a single breath of criticism could extinguish it too, you must abandon all frantic efforts to force a massive blaze. Stop demanding that you feel instantly confident, motivated, or inspired. Instead, Retreat to the quiet sanctuary of your own spirit. Kneel before the tiny, hidden ember of your deepest conviction. Recognize that the smallness of your hope right now is not a defect. It is a tactical advantage. It requires less oxygen, less fuel, and less noise to survive the storm. Cup your hands around that fragile spark. Protect it from the cynical commentary of others, and more importantly, from the corrosive whispers of your own fatigue. Feed it with deliberate, quiet acts of continuation. Whisper the sacred affirmation that preserves the inner light against the winter gale. Even when it feels small, I protect the hope that moves me forward. Let those words anchor your posture. Feel the subtle gathering warmth radiating from that single protected point within your chest. You do not need the whole world to be illuminated. You only need enough light to see the ground directly beneath your next step. Take that step, then take the next. As you carry that steady, protected flame forward, the shadows begin to retreat. The frozen landscape of your hesitation begins to thaw under the quiet friction of your movement. You are no longer standing in the dark waiting for permission to live. You are walking as the carrier of an unquenchable fire. Yet the path ahead winds deeper into the labyrinth. For protecting the flame is only the beginning. The true test lies in dismantling the subtle, sophisticated traps of the mind that whisper you are not yet ready to cross the threshold. Listen closely, for the air is growing electric, and the next chapter calls you forward into the shattering of the final illusion. There is a quiet, insidious theater where empires of purpose do not fall to crashing swords or roaring fires, but to the slow, unperceived dampness of neglect. In a secluded chamber overlooking a mist-shrouded valley, a man sits at a heavy oak table upon which rests a ledger of unfinished designs. 6 months prior, this same desk was a theater of intense combustion. Every pen stroke was a declaration of war against mediocrity, every hour a testament to an unyielding inner vow. Yet today, the ink in the glass well sits undisturbed, capped by a delicate skim of dust. The man does not stare at the ledger with rage or despair. He stares with a flat, hollow indifference. The fire that once crackled in his marrow has not been blown out by a violent gale. It has simply starved, grain by gray grain, through 1,000 tiny concessions to comfort an unmonitored repetition of doubt. He remembers the exact hour the erosion began. It did not start with a grand betrayal or a cataclysmic failure. It began with a microscopic hesitation, a single morning when the alarm chimed, the rain beat against the panes, and the mind whispered a seemingly harmless rationalization. There is no rush. Let us pause today and resume tomorrow with sharper focus. Tomorrow arrived, draped in the same gray veil, and whispered the same invitation. Each unresisted concession acted as a tiny spade, carving away another shovelful of sovereign soil beneath his feet until the foundation of his conviction eroded into hollow air. To the casual onlooker, nothing has fractured. He still attends to his daily duties, meets his obligations, and wears the mask of competence. But inwardly, the internal architecture has caved in. He no longer believes in the inevitability of his own forward motion. The quiet tragedy of this erosion is that the man remains entirely unaware of his own surrender until he attempts to lean his weight against a pillar of belief, only to find that it has turned to dust. He has not been defeated by the world. He has been quietly betrayed by the unguarded gate of his own attention. To understand how belief disintegrates without a fight, we must subject the mechanics of internal surrender to rigorous psychological and philosophical deconstruction. Why does the human mind, endowed with the capacity for monumental persistence, so easily surrender its sovereignty to the lowest excuses for standing still? Let us deploy the method of recursive thinking to unpack this subterranean dynamic. Why does unmonitored attention naturally drift toward doubt rather than conviction? The human nervous system is fundamentally lazy in an economic sense. It constantly seeks the lowest energetic pathway to maintain homeostasis. Doubt, hesitation, and self-preservation require zero active cognitive construction. They are the default background radiation of a brain tuned for survival. Conviction and belief, by contrast, require continuous, high-voltage metabolic investment. They are artificial constructs forged against the grain of biological entropy. When a man stops actively feeding his inner narrative with purpose, his attention instantly snaps back to its baseline, a passive, scanning state that notices every obstacle, magnifies every risk, and rationalizes every pause. The mind does not choose doubt out of malice. It drifts into doubt the way a riderless horse drifts toward the ditch. How does the repetition of minor hesitations structurally dismantle a man's capacity for agency? It dismantles agency through the creation of neural ruts, which philosophers of the mind term habitual grooves. When a man allows himself to pause today because the conditions are imperfect, he lays down a microscopic track in his neural circuitry. When he repeats that pause tomorrow, the track deepens. Within weeks, that track has become a canyon of least resistance. The brain learns a toxic lesson. When friction appears, we stop. The man no longer makes a conscious decision to quit. His nervous system automatically executes the subroutine of hesitation the moment an uncomfortable variable enters his field of experience. He becomes an automated prisoner of his own unmonitored concessions. Why is the first pause, the initial moment of internal surrender, so disproportionately dangerous to human destiny? Because the first pause alters the identity of the actor. Before the pause, he is a man in motion, navigating resistance. After the pause, he becomes a man in waiting, evaluating whether he should continue. That subtle linguistic and psychological shift changes everything. He is no longer fighting the mountain. He is sitting at the base of it, debating whether the climb is worth the breath. The first pause introduces negotiation into a domain that requires absolute sovereign command. Once negotiation begins, the will has already lost half its kingdom. At the philosophical core of this phenomenon lies the existential truth that the self is not a static object one possesses, but a continuous act of creation that one must perform anew in every waking second. To stop performing is to allow the architecture of the self to collapse under the gravity of inertia. The core principle is unsparing. A man does not lose his direction all at once. He loses it one unmonitored concession at a time, until hesitation feels like wisdom and surrender feels like rest. In the early autumn of 1504, during the bitter final phases of the Italian Wars, the renowned military engineer and commander Gian Giacomo Trivulzio was tasked with maintaining a vital mountain fortress perched high in the Apennine Passes, a strategic stronghold known as the Citadel of Rocca. The fortress was garrisoned by 300 vetted veterans and held enough provisions to withstand a prolonged siege. Trivulzio was a man of legendary discipline. For months, his garrison stood firm against repeated probes by opposing forces, repelling every assault through unyielding vigilance and rigorous daily routines. Every morning at dawn, Trivulzio personally inspected the outer ramparts, checked the mortar of the stone walls, and ensured that the sentries were alert. However, as the autumn rain set in, turning the mountain paths into treacherous rivers of red mud, a subtle rot began to infect the garrison. It started small. One rainy Tuesday, the captain of the inner gate, a veteran named Corrado who had served Trivulzio for a decade, approached the commander with a reasonable request. "My lord, the rain is relentless, and the mud in the lower courtyard is ankle deep. The men have been soaked to the skin for 3 days. With the enemy camped 10 leagues away in the valley below, would it not be prudent to grant the night watch a temporary relief from the outer parapet patrols? We can double the watch tomorrow when the weather clears." Trivulzio, feeling a touch of sympathy for the weary men, and noting the absence of visible enemy movement in the mist, nodded. "Very well, Corrado. Grant them tonight. Let them rest by the brazier. But ensure the patrols resume at first light." That single, humane concession was the first stone pulled from the arch. The next morning the rain continued to fall. When Corrado approached Trivulzio again, his argument was even easier. "My lord, the men slept well, but the damp has gotten into their boots. If we send them out into the mud today, half the garrison will fall to the ague. Let us hold the inner keep for one more day. The enemy cannot possibly move artillery through these mountain passes in such a tempest." Trivulzio, his mind occupied with supply ledgers and tactical maps of the valley, waved his hand dismissively. "As you judge best." Days bled into weeks. Each concession bred a dozen more. What began as a temporary suspension of the outer patrol during a storm evolved into a permanent relaxation of discipline. The sentries began to sleep through their watches. The gates were left unbolted because opening them in the damp air required too much effort. The daily inspections of the mortar were postponed because the rain made the plaster difficult to set. No enemy attacked. No dramatic breach was made. The fortress appeared outwardly secure. its gray stones rising proudly against the mountain mist. Yet, deep within the foundations, the neglect was doing its silent work. Without the vibration of daily maintenance, without the friction of rigorous discipline, the mortar between the massive stones began to absorb the moisture, softening and losing its bind. Then came a night in late November. There was no thunder, no warning fanfare of trumpets. A small, elite detachment of enemy scouts, moving silently through the dark under the cover of the storm, crept up the mountain trail. They reached the outer gate, the gate that had not been bolted in 3 weeks because the mechanism was stiff with rust and neglect. There was no sentry to challenge them. The guards were huddled around a dying brazier deep inside the keep, sharing wine and complaints about the damp. The enemy scouts leaned their shoulders against the massive oak panels. The wood gave way with a dull, muffled groan. The hinges, ungreased and rotting in the damp, parted without a shriek. Within 20 minutes, the citadel of Roca, a fortress that could have withstood a month-long cannon barrage, fell without a single sword being drawn, surrendered not to the superior strength of the invader, but to the silent, cumulative rot of unmonitored concessions. When Trivulzio was awakened by the clank of foreign steel in his quarters, he rushed to the window and looked out over the courtyard. The truth hit him with the force of a falling beam. The enemy had not conquered his fortress, he had dismantled it himself, piece by piece, hesitation by hesitation, in the quiet warmth of his own compromises. The lesson was etched in iron and stone. A kingdom is never lost at the final gate. It is surrendered at the first unresisted pause. Pause here for a sacred breath. Look closely at the unmonitored compromises in your own daily architecture, the tasks postponed, the disciplines neglected, the quiet retreats disguised as rest. If this profound exploration of momentum and inner resolve has resonated with the core of your being, like and subscribe as a deliberate vow to protect your inner flame, to seal the cracks in your fortress, and to commit never again to surrender your sovereignty to the illusion of readiness. How does a man translate this rigorous truth into the immediate, unyielding architecture of his daily existence today? When you catch yourself rationalizing a pause, when your mind invents a sophisticated, comfortable excuse to delay what you know must be done, you must arrest that thought instantly. Do not negotiate with the hesitation. Recognize it for what it is, the first subtle shovel of earth digging the grave of your momentum. Execute an immediate counter-maneuver. Force yourself to execute the exact task you are seeking to avoid, no matter how small, no matter how uncomfortable the conditions. Seal the gap in your discipline before the cold air of neglect can rush in. Anchor your resolve with the sovereign affirmation that breaks the spell of internal drift. I refuse the comfort of the pause. My momentum is my fortress. Let those words ring like steel in the silence of your mind. Feel the sudden, electric tightening of your inner resolve as you slam the gate shut against compromise. You are no longer drifting on the current of least resistance. You are standing upright at the helm, master of your own domain. Yet, as you secure the gates and turn your gaze back toward the open road, a new horizon unfurls before you. For securing the fortress is only the defensive art. The true conquest lies in mastering the dangerous, seductive fallacy that paralyzes the minds of men just before they step into the unknown. Listen closely, for the air is shifting, and the next chapter calls you forward into the shattering of the ultimate illusion. There is a gilded cage of the intellect that houses some of the finest, most capable minds of every generation, a sanctuary of exquisite paralysis known as the Hall of Infinite Preparation. In this quiet, amber-lit chamber, a man sits surrounded by monuments of industry, meticulously organized drafting tables, leather-bound journals, filled with flawless annotations, and blueprints that have been redrawn and refined until the ink has worn thin against the paper. Every surface is clean. Every variable has been anticipated, categorized, and cross-indexed with the precision of a master clockmaker. To anyone peering through the tall, leaded glass windows, this man is the picture of high-minded productivity. He moves with a deliberate, solemn grace, adjusting a compass here, verifying a statistical projection there. He appears to be on the verge of launching a monumental creation. Yet, as the clock ticks through the silent hours, the grand launch never arrives. The blueprints remain on the table. The ink dries in the pens. The door to the outside world stays securely bolted. The paradox of his existence is as subtle as it is devastating. He believes he is working, when in truth he is only hiding. He is waiting for the mystical, immaculate sensation of absolute readiness to descend upon him like a dove from the heavens. He is convinced that somewhere ahead on the calendar lies a magical Tuesday morning when all fear will vanish, when every doubt will dissolve, and when his pulse will beat with the flawless, unshakable confidence of a deity. Until that day arrives, he tells himself, prudence demands patience. He must refine the plan one more time. He must read one more treatise. He must wait for the fog in his own chest to clear before he dares set foot outside the fortress of his preparation. The air in the room is heavy with the scent of old paper and unspent ambition. Outside, the world races forward in its messy, unpredictable turbulence. Empires rise. Fortunes are forged by the imperfect, and history is written by those who stumbled into the arena half-blind. Yet inside, the scholar remains frozen in amber, trapped by the most seductive and destructive delusion known to human ambition, the belief that readiness is a prerequisite for action rather than its offspring. To shatter the fallacy of readiness, one must subject the psychology of anticipation to rigorous philosophical and psychological deconstruction. Why does the human mind cling so tenaciously to the fantasy of pre-calculated perfection, and how does this mental posture transform preparation into a gilded instrument of self-sabotage? Let us deploy the method of recursive thinking to unpack this subterranean dynamic. Why does the human intellect desperately crave the sensation of being ready before initiating a vital endeavor? The intellect craves readiness because it is pathologically intolerant of ambiguity and ego injury. To act without being ready is to expose oneself to the raw, unshielded possibility of failure, humiliation, and chaos. The ego, terrified of looking foolish or incompetent, invents the concept of readiness as an elaborate psychological toll booth. It establishes an impossible standard of pre-calculated perfection, demanding that all risks be neutralized, all skills mastered in theory, and all outcomes guaranteed before it will permit the physical body to cross the threshold into action. It is a brilliant, self-serving defense mechanism. As long as one is preparing to act, one can never actually fail. The illusion of readiness protects the ego from the painful friction of reality at the absolute expense of actual growth. How does this psychological posture manufacture an endless, self-sustaining loop of delay? It does so through the recursive trap of intellectual expansion. The more a man studies a problem from a posture of detachment, the more nuanced and complex the problem becomes to his eyes. A novice sees a simple mountain and climbs it. A scholar sees 1,000 microgeological fractures, variable wind currents, and botanical anomalies. Every book the scholar reads, every extra plan he drafts, uncovers 10 new hypothetical hazards. Thus, the very act of preparing without acting increases his sense of unreadiness. The mountain grows taller and more terrifying in his mind the longer he sits at its base drawing maps. He mistakes the accumulation of intellectual complexity for real-world progress, sinking deeper into the quicksand of his own caution, while convincing himself he is building a bridge. Why is the feeling of readiness an absolute biological and psychological impossibility prior to engagement? Because the human brain does not build the neural architecture for competence through contemplation, it builds it through collision. Confidence, mastery, and clarity are biochemical and structural adaptations to real-world friction. They are secretions of the arena, not gifts of the armchair. Expecting to feel ready before entering the unknown is like a man demanding that his muscles grow dense and powerful before he ever lifts a heavy weight. The adaptation only occurs because the stress was applied prematurely, awkwardly, and with imperfect preparation. At the philosophical core of this phenomenon lies the existential inversion of cause and effect. Readiness is not the parent of action, it is the child. One does not become ready by waiting. One becomes ready by doing the thing for which one is unready, until the unready becomes second nature. In the annals of Renaissance architecture, during the frantic expansion of the Papal States in the early 16th century, there lived a master stonemason and designer named Valerio di Vicenza. Valerio possessed what his contemporaries called the eye of angels, a mind capable of visualizing sprawling cathedrals, aqueducts, and fortified bastions with breathtaking mathematical harmony. In the spring of 1512, The city-state of Siena commissioned Valerio to design and construct a massive defensive bulwark across the treacherous southern gorge of the Val di Merce, a strategic pass constantly threatened by rival mercenary armies. The contract was lucrative, and the stakes were absolute. If the bridge fortress was not completed before the autumn rains, the valley would lie wide open to invasion. Valerio accepted the commission with profound enthusiasm. He retreated to his private studio in Florence, taking with him 3 apprentices and a mountain of vellum. For 4 solid months, while the summer sun beat down on the hills, Valerio did not lay a single stone in the Val di Merce. Instead, he drew. He drafted over 400 distinct architectural sheets. He calculated the compressive strength of travertine limestone under varying degrees of seismic vibration. He consulted ancient Roman treatises on hydraulic mortar. When his lead apprentice, a practical young builder named Sandro, pointed out that the construction season was slipping away and urged him to move the workshop to the gorge, Valerio shook his head with serene intellectual condescension. "Sandro," Valerio replied, tapping a freshly inked parchment with his silver stylus, "you speak with the impatience of a common laborer. A bridge thrown across the Meuse without absolute calculation is a monument to folly. The foundation stones must be selected with flawless precision. The arch vectors must account for the spring floods. When I am completely ready, when every contingency is accounted for on these sheets, we shall lay the cornerstone. Until then, haste is the architect of ruin." August arrived, blistering and dry. Still, Valerio remained in his Florentine studio, refining the 17th iteration of the parapet design. Then, on the first night of September, the weather broke with sudden, terrifying violence. The great autumn cloudbursts, unseasonal and monstrous, slammed into the Apennine peaks. Within 48 hours, the gentle stream of the Val di Merce swelled into a raging black torrent of mud, boulders, and churning white water, roaring down the gorge with enough kinetic fury to snap ancient oaks like dry twigs. Word reached Valerio in Florence that the flood had carved away the natural banks of the gorge, altering the bedrock topography entirely. The master mason rushed down to the Val di Merce with his portfolios under his arm, eager to inspect the damage. When he arrived at the site, his heart turned to lead. The gorge he had meticulously mapped and calculated across 400 sheets of vellum no longer existed in that form. The banks had collapsed. The anchoring points for his grand arches had washed away into the churning abyss. All his months of exquisite preparation, his perfect calculations, his flawless blueprints, his absolute pursuit of readiness, were rendered instantly obsolete by the raw, unyielding violence of reality. Standing beside him on the muddy bank was a rival master builder, an unpolished old pragmatist named Matteo, who had been hastily hired by the city council when Valerio failed to appear. Matteo had brought no portfolios, no complex mathematical treatises, no guarantees of perfection. In June, recognizing that conditions were chaotic and unpredictable, Matteo had simply marched 30 men into the gorge, cut timber for cofferdams, dumped rough-hewn basalt boulders directly into the rushing shallows, and laid the first wet, imperfect courses of stone by hand, adjusting his design week by week as the river shifted beneath his boots. While Valerio's pristine blueprints sat useless in the mud, Matteo's rough, unfinished bulwark, battered, asymmetrical, and built without the luxury of complete certainty, stood firm against the raging torrent, absorbing the impact of the floodwaters through the sheer kinetic mass of its ongoing construction. Valerio looked from his worthless papers to the roaring river, and the bitter truth of his academic paralysis struck him with the force of a falling beam. He had sought to conquer uncertainty with preparation, and in doing so, uncertainty had destroyed him before he even began. The lesson was etched in stone and rushing water. The man who waits for conditions to be perfect before he builds will spend his life holding a pencil while others build castles in the storm. How does a man translate this profound truth into the concrete architecture of his daily existence today? When you catch yourself trapped in the endless loop of preparation, when you realize that you are reading another book, drafting another list, or telling yourself that you need just a little more clarity before you take the plunge, you must recognize the trap of the hall of infinite preparation. Stop planning. Stop refining. Stop demanding that the universe hand you a guarantee of success before you step onto the field. Execute an immediate, unceremonious break with your hesitation. Take the most imperfect, raw, unfinished version of your project, your message, or your task, and thrust it directly into the physical world today. Do not wait until you feel confident. Do not wait until your skills match your vision. Act in the state of total unreadiness, trusting that the friction of reality will shape your competence far better than any amount of solitary rumination. Anchor your resolve with the sovereign affirmation that shatters the myth of preparation. I drop the demand for perfection. My competence is forged in the fire of execution. Let those words ring like an iron hammer against an anvil. Feel the sudden, exhilarating rush of adrenaline as the safety net of preparation falls away and you find yourself standing unsupported in the arena of reality. You are no longer a scholar hiding behind blueprints. You are a creator bringing something raw and living into existence. Yet, as you take that bold, unhesitating step into the unknown, the landscape begins to change. The fog does not clear because you wished it away. It parts because your feet are cutting a path through the mist. Listen closely, for the air is growing clear, and the next chapter calls you forward into the profound discovery of how true clarity is born. There is an ancient, pervasive optical illusion that haunts the human imagination. The belief that light precedes the journey, that the lantern must illuminate the entire length of a dark forest before the traveler is permitted to take his first step. In the quiet hours of nocturnal contemplation, a man stands at the edge of an untrodden wilderness, peering into a dense charcoal-gray fog that swallows the horizon just 10 paces beyond his boots. He waits for the mist to roll back. He squints into the gloom, searching for a shaft of sunlight or a painted signpost that might vouchsafe the wisdom of his intended path. Minute after minute ticks away on his pocket watch. The mist remains stagnant, cold, and impenetrable. The world beyond his immediate reach is a void of absolute ambiguity. Yet if he were to possess the supreme audacity to step forward, not with the arrogant swagger of certainty, but with the quiet, trembling resolve of a man who accepts the dark, a wondrous and counterintuitive phenomenon occurs. The fog does not vanish from the world. Rather, it parts in direct proportion to his movement. Each step he takes forward dissolves the specific pocket of mist that occupies the space immediately before him. The landscape reveals itself not in a sudden panoramic flash of divine revelation, but in narrow sequential increments, one footfall at a time, earned through the physical friction of advance. Most men never discover this secret. They spend their entire lives standing at the woodline, shivering in the damp air, accusing the heavens of withholding a map that was never meant to be printed in advance. They do not understand that the universe operates on a kinetic economy. Clarity is not a commodity given to spectators who wait on the shore. It is a manufactured artifact forged exclusively in the roaring engine of motion. The light does not illuminate the path until the feet are already walking upon it. To master the mechanics of kinetic clarity, we must subject the relationship between understanding and action to rigorous philosophical and psychological deconstruction. Why does the human mind stubbornly insist that vision must precede velocity, and how does this inversion poison our capacity to navigate complex transitions? Let us deploy the method of recursive thinking to unpack this vital psychological architecture. Why does the brain instinctively treat uncertainty as a permanent state rather than a temporary moving boundary? The brain is a pattern recognition machine that relies on historical data to predict future outcomes. When confronted with an entirely new domain, a career shift, a creative leap, or an existential crossroad, the brain finds zero historical files matching the current coordinates. Because it cannot calculate the variables, it signals a red alert, interpreting the absence of data as absolute blindness. It assumes that because it cannot see 10 steps ahead, no steps can be taken safely. The mind fails to realize that the boundary of visibility is not a fixed wall. It is a mobile horizon that shifts forward synchronously with the traveler's physical advance. What is invisible from 10 paces away becomes entirely clear once the first 9 paces have been traversed. How does kinetic action physically and psychologically generate the clarity that contemplation fails to produce? Action generates clarity through the vital mechanism of empirical feedback. When a man sits in a room thinking about a problem, he is operating within a closed loop of abstract imagination, where every hypothetical obstacle grows distorted and monstrous. The moment he takes a physical action, however, he introduces real-world friction. The universe pushes back. He receives empirical data. This material is harder than I thought. This method yields resistance. This door is unlocked. That raw, unvarnished feedback bypasses the anxious loops of the ego and feeds the intellect precise, actionable intelligence. Action acts as a battering ram against ambiguity. It smashes the blurred outlines of a theoretical problem into sharp, undeniable reality. Why do intellectual explanations and theoretical models always lag behind lived experience? Because theory is an autopsy of the past, while action is the midwifery of the future. A map can only describe territory that has already been trodden by someone else. When a man seeks to pioneer a new path in his own life, there are no existing maps. Waiting for a map to appear before moving is waiting for an impossibility. The map is not drawn by cartographers sitting in libraries. It is scratched into the dirt by the boots of the pioneers who walked blindly into the thicket and left a trail for those who follow. At the philosophical core of this dynamic lies the profound reversal of the Cartesian axiom, I move, therefore I come to know. Descartes declared, I think, therefore I am, anchoring human existence in passive ratiocination. But heroic existence requires a deeper, more dynamic realization. Understanding is not the prerequisite of movement. It is the residue of it. The man who refuses to move until he understands everything will die in total ignorance. The man who moves despite his ignorance will wake up one day to find that understanding has quietly overtaken him. In the rugged wilderness of the North American frontier during the harsh winter of 1805, an exploratory detachment led by Pathfinder Captain Silas Vance was tasked with crossing the jagged, uncharted peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. The expedition had reached a terrifying high plateau, choked by a relentless, blinding blizzard that completely obliterated the mountain passes. The snow fell in thick, silent curtains, reducing visibility to less than 6 feet. The surrounding landscape was a terrifying labyrinth of sheer limestone drops, hidden crevasses, and frozen ravines. For 2 days, the expedition huddled beneath an overhanging granite ledge, paralyzed by the whiteout. Their chief topographic officer, an academic named Dr. Alistair Vance, no relation to the captain, spent his hours huddled over parchment maps, trying to calculate their precise coordinates using dead reckoning and barometric pressure. Captain Alistair announced gravely on the third morning, adjusting his spectacles with stiff, frostbitten fingers, our calculations indicate that we are trapped in a dead zone between two unscalable gorges. According to my models, if we move in any direction without exact visibility, the probability of plunging into a ravine is 94%. We must remain stationary until the storm clears and the sun reveals the true topography of the pass. To move blind is suicide. Captain Silas Vance looked out at the swirling white abyss. He felt the bitter wind stinging his cheeks, and he saw the quiet despair settling into the eyes of his men. He knew Alistair was technically correct. By every rule of surveying, cartography, and prudent logic, moving through a blinding blizzard without a visible path was sheer madness. Yet Silas also knew the cruel arithmetic of the high altitude. If they stayed beneath the ledge another 24 hours without physical exertion, the sub-zero temperatures would drop their core body heat to the point of permanent stasis. Waiting for the sky to clear was not preservation. It was a slow, dignified execution. Silas stood up, strapped his snowshoes tight, and picked up his ashwood climbing staff. Alistair, Silas said, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind with calm authority, your maps are masterpieces of the past, but they cannot save us from the present. The mountain will not show its secrets to a man who sits huddled under a rock waiting for permission to live. We are not going to wait for the fog to lift. We are going to walk and let the ground reveal itself beneath our snowshoes. Alistair stared at him in horror. Are you mad? Where will you step? I will step where my foot lands, Silas replied quietly, and the next step will appear when I take it. Without another word, Silas Vance stepped out from beneath the protective ledge and marched straight into the blinding white wall of the blizzard. The first 100 paces were a terrifying exercise in faith. He could not see the drop-off 3 feet to his left. He felt his way forward like a blind man in a dark room, testing every drift with his staff, leaning his weight into the howling wind. The men, inspired by the solitary courage of their leader, fell in line behind him, single file, tethered by a rope of braided hemp, stepping carefully into the footprints left by the captain's boots. For 3 grueling hours they crawled across the high plateau in absolute whiteout conditions. There was no sun, no horizon, no reassuring landmarks. There was only the rhythmic crunch of snowshoes and the steady, unyielding forward drive of the column. Then, as they crested a low ridge, something miraculous occurred. The wind shifted. A sudden, violent draft from the western valley caught the dense bank of clouds and tore a ragged hole in the center of the white canopy. A shaft of pale golden sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating a wide, safe descent winding down between 2 treacherous rock walls directly into the green valleys of the west. The path had been there all along, hidden just 50 paces ahead of where they had been cowering beneath the rock ledge. They would never have found it had they remained stationary. The mountain had kept its secret locked away until their movement forced it to yield. As the men poured down the sunlit slope, Alistair Vance closed his leather portfolio of maps and tucked it into his pack. He looked back up at the swirling mist on the ridge, and the profound truth of the journey settled deep into his bones. The fog does not part for the scholar who maps it, it parts for the traveler who marches through it. How does a man translate this profound truth into the concrete architecture of his daily existence today? When you find yourself paralyzed by uncertainty, when the path ahead is obscured by the fog of a complex decision, an ambiguous career move, or an unwritten creative endeavor, you must shatter the habit of waiting for absolute visibility. Stop scanning the horizon for a sign that will never appear. Recognize that your demand for a fully illuminated map is simply fear wearing the mask of prudence. Take one decisive, irreversible step into the gray space today. Send the message, draft the outline, make the call, or purchase the ticket. Do not worry about steps 2, 3, and 4. They are none of your concern right now. Your sole obligation is to earn the clarity of step 2 by executing step 1. Let the action break the spell of hesitation. Anchor your resolve with the sovereign affirmation that unlocks the hidden path. I move forward even when the path is not fully clear. Let those words resonate through your consciousness like a bell tolling in an empty cathedral. Feel the dense fog of anxiety part the moment your intention translates into kinetic force. You are no longer a victim of uncertainty, you are its master, carving your destiny out of the raw material of the unknown. Yet, as you stride forward into the widening path of your own creation, the landscape begins to steepen. The initial burst of momentum meets the hard, unyielding stone of prolonged adversity, the deep crucible where ordinary men falter and extraordinary characters are forged in silence. Listen closely, for the ground is turning to iron, and the next chapter calls you forward into the fires of unyielding endurance. There is a profound, silent hour in the life of any serious undertaking when the initial combustion of inspiration has completely burned away, leaving behind only the cold, unyielding iron of routine and resistance. In a darkened foundry deep within the mountain of human trial, a man stands alone before an anvil that has seen 1,000 strikes. The fire in the pit has settled from a blinding, celebratory white to a steady, monochromatic orange glow that casts long, skeletal shadows against the soot-stained stone walls. Outside, the seasons have turned. The applause of the crowd has long since faded into a distant, mocking echo, and the milestones that once promised immediate gratification have dissolved into an endless, unbroken stretch of gray highway. Every muscle in his body aches with a dull, accumulated fatigue. His hands are calloused, cracked, and blackened by coal dust. Each lift of the heavy hammer feels as though it defies the fundamental laws of gravity, and the metal beneath his strike refuses to show any dramatic, visible alteration. To the superficial observer looking in from the sunlit world above, this man is trapped in a state of stagnation, a tragic figure marching in place upon a treadmill of endless repetition. Yet, this is the great paradox of the crucible. The most important work is never done in the light of celebration. It is hammered out in the absolute silence of invisible endurance. The air in the foundry is thick with the metallic scent of sweat and heated carbon. There are no trumpets here. There are no witnesses to applaud the 100th strike or the 1,000th repetition. There is only the rhythmic, unforgiving cadence of the hammer hitting the anvil. The man is tested not by the complexity of a brilliant strategy, but by the sheer stubborn integrity of his spine. Can he continue when progress is entirely invisible? Can he sustain his sovereign will when the reward has vanished over the horizon, and the only thing left in the room is the weight of the hammer and the unyielding resistance of the iron? To comprehend the transformative mechanics of endurance, we must subject the psychology of prolonged resistance to rigorous philosophical and psychological deconstruction. Why does the human spirit require the crucible of invisible labor, and how does the unglamorous burden of persistence forge a density of character that comfort can never produce? Let us deploy the method of recursive thinking to unpack this subterranean dynamic. Why does the human nervous system instinctively rebel against prolonged periods of invisible, unrewarded effort? The human nervous system is chemically addicted to immediate dopamine loops, the rapid feedback of praise, visible milestones, and quick victories. When these external rewards are stripped away during a prolonged plateau of endurance, the brain experiences a form of chemical withdrawal. It interprets the silence of the universe as failure. It whispers doubts, manufactures fatigue, and urges the individual to quit or seek easier terrain. The nervous system rebels because it confuses comfort with survival. It does not recognize that true psychological and spiritual density is only built under conditions of high, sustained friction, where no immediate reward is forthcoming to justify the cost. How does the unyielding repetition of unrewarded labor structurally alter the architecture of the human will? It alters the will by burning away the dross of ego and conditional motivation. When a man is driven solely by the desire for applause or fast results, his character is hollow, like a decorative cast-iron facade that looks sturdy until it is tested by a real storm. But when he is forced to labor for months or years in total obscurity, sustained only by the pure, unadorned decision to continue, the ego is starved. In its place, a dense, forged steel core of sovereign agency takes root. The man no longer needs external weather to be favorable in order to move. His internal engine has become entirely self-sustaining. He acts because it is his nature to act, not because a reward waits at the finish line. Why is the absence of visible progress the ultimate prerequisite for true mastery? Because if the universe rewarded every single effort with immediate, dazzling feedback, man would remain perpetually infantile, a creature motivated only by treats rather than truth. The plateau of invisible progress acts as a rigorous filter, weeding out the tourists of ambition and leaving only the masters. It forces the individual to fall in love with the process of the strike rather than the product of the outcome. When a man learns to derive his dignity from the quality of his endurance rather than the applause of the audience, he becomes truly invincible. At the philosophical core of this phenomenon lies the ancient Stoic realization that difficulty is not an interruption of life, but the very material out of which life is forged. The obstacle is not in the path, it is the path. The core principle is austere and absolute. Character is never revealed in moments of ease. It is forged in the silent crucible of unrewarded endurance. The man who can outlast the silence will eventually command the dawn. In the annals of European metallurgy during the height of the medieval guild era, there lived a legendary master swordsman and bladesmith named Master Gottfried of Solingen. Gottfried was commissioned by the royal court of the Palatinate to forge the Schwert der Treue, the legendary sword of fidelity intended to be the permanent ceremonial blade of the realm's supreme council. The commission came with a strict, brutal stipulation. The blade had to be hammered from a single, hyper-dense billet of meteoric iron, known for its extreme resistance to shaping and its terrifying tendency to shatter under careless strikes. Gottfried accepted the challenge. He retreated to his private workshop, bolting the heavy oak doors against the outside world. For 6 solid months, no visitor was admitted. The work was an exercise in pure, unadulterated torment. Meteoric iron does not yield to gentle persuasion. It demands thousands upon thousands of precise, rhythmic hammer blows at precisely controlled temperatures. For the first 2 months, the blade took shape rapidly, glowing bright orange, and stretching gracefully across the anvil. Gottfried felt the pride of creation swelling in his chest. Then, during the third month, the work entered the gray zone of molecular densification. To the naked eye, the sword looked finished. Its shape was true. Its edge was honed to a fine line. But Gottfried knew the secret of true steel. The inner grain was still loose, filled with microscopic fissures invisible to the surface gaze. To cure the metal, it required 3 additional months of relentless, high-temperature pounding, striking the exact same surface areas over and over again, not to change the shape, but to force the iron molecules into absolute, unbreakable alignment. During this entire second phase, there was zero visible change in the blade. Day after day, week after week, Gottfried lifted the heavy 20-pound iron hammer, brought it crashing down upon the metal, and listened to the dull, heavy thud echo off the stone walls. The work produced no new beauty, no dramatic milestones, no external praise. His shoulders throbbed with a deep, systemic ache. His palms were covered in thick, overlapping layers of hardened scar tissue. One afternoon, his youngest apprentice, a talented youth named Hans, who had grown weary of the monotonous, unrewarded pounding, dropped his tongs on the stone floor and confronted his master. "Master Gottfried," Hans cried out, his voice echoing with frustration in the damp room. "Look at the blade! It is identical to what it was 60 days ago. We are striking an iron that refuses to change. The council will never know the difference whether we pound this thing for another hour or another year. Why do we break our backs in this dark room for a blade that already looks complete? Let us finish it and present it to the court." Gottfried did not raise his voice. He did not look up from the glowing hearth. He lowered his hammer, wiped the sweat from his soot-stained brow with the back of his forearm, and gestured for the boy to step closer to the anvil. "Hans," Gottfried said softly, his voice carrying the deep resonance of a church bell, "you think the work is about what the eye can see from the outside. You judge the value of the hammer blow by how much the metal leaps. But true strength is not born on the surface where the light shines. It is hammered into the dark, silent heart of the grain. If I stop today because the blade looks finished to your impatient eyes, the steel will remain brittle. The first time this sword meets a genuine test in the field of battle, it will shatter into 1,000 pieces against an ordinary shield. The weight you feel in your arms right now is not punishment, Hans. It is the density of eternity being beaten into the iron." Gottfried picked up the heavy hammer, squared his stance, and resumed his relentless cadence. Clang, clang, clang. When the 6 months were finally complete, the sword of fidelity was subjected to the grand trial before the entire royal council, a test where the blade was forced to strike a solid block of hardened Swedish armor plate with maximum kinetic violence. While a dozen magnificent ceremonial swords forged in haste by rival smiths snapped cleanly in half upon impact, Gottfried's blade struck the armor with a resonant bell-like ring, carving clean through the steel without suffering so much as a microscopic microfracture or a bent tip. It became an immortal masterpiece, not because it was beautiful to look at, but because it had been hammered in the absolute silence of endurance. The lesson was forged in iron and sweat. Magnitude is never an accident of birth or a gift of circumstance. It is the inevitable byproduct of a man who refused to stop striking when the world stopped watching. How does a man translate this profound truth into the concrete architecture of his daily existence today? When you find yourself deep in the unglamorous trenches of your work, when the initial excitement has evaporated, when your daily efforts produce zero visible applause, and when the heavy hammer of routine feels impossible to lift, you must consciously surrender your addiction to immediate validation. Stop scanning the horizon for a sign that progress is being noticed. Recognize that this silent, unrewarded season is not a punishment. It is the sacred crucible where your true character is being forged. Do not seek escape from the pressure. Lean directly into it. Take the heavy tool of your daily discipline and execute your work with absolute, uncompromised integrity, knowing that every unseen strike is densifying the grain of your soul. Anchor your resolve with the sovereign affirmation that protects your endurance against the erosion of time. I embrace the silence of the crucible. My strength is hammered out in the dark. Let those words vibrate through your chest like a tolling bell. Feel the sudden electric straightening of your spine as you accept the heavy burden of your path without complaint. You are no longer a child begging for a reward. You are a master smith shaping your own destiny out of raw, unyielding iron. Yet, as you stand steadfast in the foundry of your endurance, the soot begins to clear, and a familiar, ancient presence stirs in the deep recesses of your memory. A part of you that has survived every past trial awakens from its long slumber. Listen closely, for the fire is flaring up anew, and the next chapter calls you forward into the profound reconnection with your unbroken core. There is an hour in the late autumn of a man's trial when the external world has fallen completely silent, and the accumulated debris of 1,000 minor compromises, failures, and anxieties has settled into a thick layer of dust over his consciousness. He sits alone in the stillness of a darkened study, staring at his reflection in the cold glass of a midnight window. The face looking back at him is lined with the weathering of uncounted storms. The eyes carry the heavy, amber tint of endurance. He feels fragile, hollowed out by the sheer velocity of the pressures he has navigated, convinced that the margin of his resilience has finally been exhausted. Yet beneath this superficial crust of exhaustion, in the deep, untrodden catacombs of his spirit, a profound and startling paradox reveals itself. The core of his being, that ancient, unyielding seat of agency that carried him through the hungers of his youth, the shattering losses of his middle years, and the quiet despairs of yesterday has not been destroyed. It has merely gone quiet. It has withdrawn into the deep interior, sleeping beneath the ash of doubt like an eternal ember, waiting for the breath of sovereign recollection. Most men spend their entire lives identifying with the storm on the surface. They mistake their temporary fatigue for permanent incapacity. They look at the trembling of their hands and conclude that the engine of their will has cracked beyond repair. But the silent observer watching from the dark recognizes the profound truth of the human constitution. The superficial self breaks under pressure, but the sovereign core is indestructible. It does not ask for comfort. It asks only to be remembered. When a man stops searching for external rescues and turns his gaze inward, he does not find a void. He finds an altar of unyielding iron that has outlived every empire of fear he ever constructed in his mind. To understand how a man reconnects with his unbroken core when all external reinforcement has collapsed, we must subject the architecture of human identity to rigorous psychological and philosophical deconstruction. Why does the ego so easily forget its own native strength, and how does the recovery of the deeper self alter the physics of human agency? Let us deploy the method of recursive thinking to unpack this subterranean dynamic. Why does the human mind default to identifying with its weakest, most exhausted states during prolonged adversity? The mind identifies with fatigue because fatigue generates loud, insistent sensory signals: pain, heaviness, doubt, and fear. These signals dominate the conscious theater of awareness because they are biologically engineered to demand rest. When a man is tired, his nervous system floods his awareness with alarms, shouting that he is broken, incapable, and finished. The ego mistakes this biological alarm bell for ontological truth. It concludes that because the feeling of strength is absent, strength itself no longer exists. The mind lacks the discipline to look past the surface weather of its own biochemistry to perceive the unmoving bedrock of identity that lies untouched beneath the waves. How does the process of conscious reconnection restore the broken bridge between thought and sovereign agency? It does so by shifting the center of gravity from the narrative of suffering to the witness of suffering. When a man steps back from his immediate panic and asks, "Who is it that observes this fatigue?" he performs a radical act of psychological disidentification. He realizes that he is not the fear, nor the doubt, nor the exhaustion. He is the sovereign consciousness that observes them. This realization instantly shatters the monopoly of despair. It reconnects him with the ancestral lineage of his own past victories, reminding him of the storms he has already weathered, the trials he has already survived, and the quiet resilience that carried him across thresholds where lesser men turned back. Why is this reconnection the mandatory turning point for anyone attempting to break the cycle of stagnation? Because no amount of external strategy, tactical planning, or motivational fuel can save a man who has lost touch with his internal sovereign. If a man believes at his core that he is weak, every strategy he deploys will be infected by hesitation. He will build his house out of temporary excuses. But once he touches the unbroken core, once he feels the cold, hard reality of his own indestructible agency, his posture changes entirely. He stops asking the universe for permission to succeed. He acts from a place of quiet, unshakable sovereignty. At the philosophical core of this phenomenon lies the ancient insight of the mystery traditions and the Stoic masters. You carry within you an unassailable citadel that can never be breached by circumstance unless you voluntarily surrender the keys. The core principle is absolute. The strength that carried you through every dark hour of your past has not vanished. It has merely been buried beneath the accumulated weight of your forgetting. Unearth it, and the storm loses its power. In the annals of the northern island kingdoms during the fierce Viking incursions of the 9th century, there lived a legendary chieftain known as Eric the Steadfast. Eric had led his clan through decades of relentless warfare, surviving mortal wounds, bitter sieges, and the catastrophic loss of his entire fleet during a winter tempest off the rocky coasts of Jutland. Following the disaster of the storm, Eric's clan found themselves stranded on a desolate, ice-choked shore, outnumbered 3-1 by a hostile invading host. The men were starving, freezing, and utterly demoralized. Their shields were splintered, their swords notched, and the fires of their ambition reduced to a cold gray ash of despair. On the eve of what many assumed would be their final stand, Eric walked away from the campfires out onto a lonely, windswept promontory overlooking the black, churning sea. He sat upon a slab of granite, his head bowed, his massive frame shaking not with fear, but with a profound, soul-crushing fatigue. He felt old. He felt empty. The memories of his past victories felt like fairy tales told to a stranger. He looked at his scarred hands and whispered into the wind that he could carry the burden no further, that the strength of his youth was gone, and that his people would perish because his spirit had run dry. As he sat there in the dark, a quiet figure approached him from the shadows behind the rock, an old blind skald named Vane, who had walked beside Eric through every battle since they were boys. Vane carried no weapons, only a heavy wooden harp carved from ancient ash. Without speaking a word, the old blind man sat beside the chieftain in the freezing wind, placed the harp across his knees, and began to strike a slow, deep, resonant chord. Then, in a voice that carried the gravelly timbre of forgotten sagas, Vane began to sing not of the present defeat, but of the great bridge at Raven's Ridge 20 winters prior, where Eric, standing entirely alone against a wall of shields, had held the pass until reinforcements arrived. He sang of the frozen march across the White Mountains, when Eric had carried a wounded boy on his back for 3 days without food. He sang of the blood, the salt, and the fire that had forged the clan's survival. Eric closed his eyes. As the ancient verses rolled over him like a rising tide, something miraculous occurred in the dark chambers of his memory. The superficial layer of his present exhaustion, the cold, the fear, the defeatism began to burn away under the heat of sovereign recollection. He remembered who he was. Not the tired man sitting on a frozen rock in the dark, but the chieftain whose bloodline was forged from the salt of the sea and the unyielding iron of the north. The connection to his unbroken core, severed by the panic of immediate defeat, snapped back into place with the force of a drawn bowstring. Eric stood up. The stoop vanished from his massive shoulders. His eyes, dead and heavy moments before, caught the cold starlight and burned with a fierce, quiet intensity. He did not ask Vane for a new strategy, nor did he pray for the storm to abate. He simply turned back toward the camp, drew his notched blade from its rusted scabbard, and walked among his sleeping warriors. He did not need to shout. He did not need to offer grand, hollow promises. His presence alone, radiating the unshakable, restored sovereignty of his unbroken core, infused the camp with an electric, undeniable current of resolve. The men woke, looked into their leader's eyes, and saw that the fire had returned. The next morning, when the invading host swept down from the ridge expecting an easy slaughter, they met a wall of shields held by men who had touched the bedrock of their own survival. Eric and his clan broke the enemy line, secured their freedom, and carved their names into the everlasting stone of history. The lesson was forged in blood and memory. A man is never defeated by the enemy at his gate. He is defeated only when he forgets the invincible core that beats within his chest. How does a man translate this profound realization into the immediate, unyielding architecture of his daily existence today? When you feel hollowed out by the pressures of your life, when your spirit is exhausted, your confidence is frayed, and you feel as though you have reached the absolute limit of what you can endure, you must execute an intentional inward retreat. Stop looking outward for a rescue, a sign, or a softer pillow. Withdraw from the noise of the world. Close your eyes, breathe deep into the center of your chest, and consciously strip away the superficial layers of your current panic, your immediate fatigue, and your temporary failures. Reach down past the weather of your emotions until your fingers touch the solid, immutable bedrock of your own sovereign history. Remember who you are. Recall the storms you have already survived, the impossible odds you have already overcome, and the quiet, indestructible strength that has carried you this far. Anchor your resolve with the sovereign affirmation that reconnects you to your ancient core. The storms change, but the core remains. I stand unbroken upon the bedrock of my resolve. Let those words echo through the silent halls of your mind like a master chord on an ancient harp. Feel the sudden electric surge of sovereign power rush back into your limbs. You are no longer a victim of your fatigue. You are the master of your own destiny, anchored in a strength that time cannot diminish and circumstance cannot break. Yet, as you rise from that inner sanctuary, standing tall and resolute against the howling winds of the world, the final threshold opens before you. The journey of 10,000 steps has led you to this exact, decisive moment. Listen closely, for the horizon is ablaze with the first cold light of dawn, and the final chapter calls you forward into your ultimate sovereign integration. There is a final, razor-thin threshold in the geography of human trial that every architect of destiny must cross alone, a silent, wind-swept ridge where the familiar paths of hesitation, comfort, and excuse vanish entirely into the mist. In this high, rarefied air, a man stands at the absolute edge of an unmapped precipice. Behind him lies the sprawling, familiar valley of his past, a landscape cluttered with the ruins of half-finished enterprises, the ghosts of unexpressed potential, and the comforting rationalizations of why waiting for certainty was a virtue. Before him stretches the vast, ink-black expanse of the unknown, silent and absolute, offering neither guarantees nor applause. The wind howls across the ridge, carrying the scent of pine, salt, and distant snow. Every instinct of his biological programming screams for retreat. It whispers that he has done enough, that the climb was steep enough, and that returning to the valley, where the fire is warm and the expectations are low, is the safest, most rational course of action. Yet, as he looks down at the valley of his former self, he realizes a terrifying truth. Safety is the one thing the valley can no longer offer him. To return to comfort is to die a slow, spiritual death. To stand frozen on the ridge is to be consumed by the frost of indecision. In this ultimate, unheralded moment, the entire journey from the first shattered illusion of reason to the quiet endurance of the crucible converges into a single, razor-sharp point of choice. There are no more maps to consult, no more mentors to question, and no more excuses to deploy. There is only the man, the precipice, and the sovereign will burning within his chest. The observer watching from the shadows recognizes that destiny is not awarded to the clever, the cautious, or the certified. It is claimed exclusively by the man who looks into the void, drops his excuses, and makes the unforced, irreversible decision to step forward into the fire of his own creation. To master the mechanics of the sovereign decision, we must subject the psychology of ultimate commitment to rigorous philosophical and psychological deconstruction. Why does the final act of total surrender to momentum require an absolute severing of all psychological safety nets? And how does this integration transform a broken traveler into an unshakable architect of reality? Let us deploy the method of recursive thinking to unpack this final transcendent dynamic. Why does the human ego cling so desperately to escape hatches even after months of endurance and preparation? The ego clings to escape hatches because it is fundamentally invested in self-preservation rather than self-transcendence. Even when a man is committed to a difficult path, his ego secretly maintains a rear exit, a mental fallback position where he can retreat, lick his wounds, and explain to the world why failure was inevitable. This psychological insurance policy acts as a silent anchor, dragging against the hull of his ambition. As long as a man has a place to retreat, he will never throw the entirety of his sovereign weight into the advance. He holds back 30% of his energy for the parachute, ensuring that his breakthrough remains perpetually out of reach. How does the absolute, irreversible closing of the escape hatch fundamentally alter the biochemistry and physics of human action? When the escape hatch is permanently welded shut, when a man consciously burns his ships upon the shore, a radical neurological and spiritual shift occurs. The brain, recognizing that retreat is no longer a biological option, stops wasting metabolic energy calculating ways out of the conflict. It redirects 100% of its cognitive and creative bandwidth toward finding a way through. The terror of the void is instantly transmuted into a fierce, laser-focused clarity. The man's movements become decisive, economic, and devastatingly effective. He no longer acts with hesitation. He acts with the absolute sovereignty of a man who knows that his only salvation lies on the other side of the mountain. Why is the final integration of hope, endurance, and uncalculated action the ultimate destination of human maturity? Because maturity is not the accumulation of safe answers. It is the courage to live gracefully within unresolvable mystery. The integrated man no longer demands that the universe explain itself before he moves. He no longer requires comfort as a condition for courage. He has synthesized the logic of the mind, the endurance of the body, and the fire of the spirit into a single, unified weapon of destiny. He is no longer at war with uncertainty. He has made uncertainty his ally, walking through the mist with the quiet dignity of a king traversing his own domain. At the philosophical core of this phenomenon lies the ancient existential truth articulated by the masters of antiquity. A man does not find himself by looking backward into his history. He invents himself by stepping forward into his destiny. The core principle is absolute and final. The sovereign decision requires no justification, no applause, and no guarantee. It requires only a man who has decided that his potential is greater than his fear, and who steps into the dark with the absolute conviction that the ground will rise to meet his stride. In the annals of ancient maritime exploration during the early Hellenistic era, there is no account more transcendent than that of Commander Leonidas of Phocaea and his expedition to the uncharted western seas. For 3 years, Leonidas and his crew had sailed the edge of the known map, battling monstrous tempests, mutinies, hunger, and the paralyzing terror of the abyss. When the expedition finally reached the legendary Strait of Pillars, the absolute boundary beyond which no Greek ship had ever sailed, and from which ancient legend decreed no traveler ever returned, the fleet dropped anchor in a sheltered cove as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and gold. That night, dissent swept through the fleet. The captains of the supporting vessels came aboard Leonidas's flagship, their faces etched with the deep, hollow lines of exhaustion and superstitious dread. "Commander," the senior captain spoke for them all, his voice trembling in the lantern light of the cabin. "We have gone farther than any men before us. We have mapped the coastlines, survived the great gales, and proven our courage before the gods. But beyond this strait lies the outer dark, the domain of sea monsters and the edge of the world. Our provisions are thin, our hulls are strained, and the men are broken. We must turn back. To sail beyond this pillar is certain destruction." Leonidas listened in absolute silence. He looked at the men who had shared his salt and his blood for 3 grueling years. He understood their terror. He felt the same fatigue tearing at his own joints. The temptation to turn back, to return to the safe harbors of the civilized world, where they would be welcomed as heroes of the known map, was a powerful, seductive siren song. He stood up, walked slowly to the stern window of the cabin, and looked out across the dark, churning waters, where the great stone pillars of the strait loomed like silent guardians of the void. "You speak of safety," Leonidas said quietly, his voice carrying the deep, unshakable resonance of command. "You speak of returning to the harbor where our names are known and our comfort is guaranteed. But look closely at what remains of us here. If we turn back now, we do not return as conquerors. We return as men who reached the gates of eternity and lacked the stomach to turn the key. The harbor behind us is a graveyard of unspent potential. We did not build these ships to spend our lives riding at anchor in sight of the shore. We were forged for the deep." Without waiting for their reply, Leonidas issued an order that sent shockwaves through the fleet. "Unfurl all canvas, weigh anchor, helm hard starboard into the strait." The captain stared at him in horrified disbelief, realizing the magnitude of his decree. There was no turning back now. As the fleet sailed out past the towering stone pillars and into the vast, ink-black expanse of the open ocean, Leonidas walked to the prow of his flagship, drew his ceremonial bronze sword from its scabbard, and hurled it with all his might far out into the dark, churning wake of the ship. It was a total, irreversible severing of the retreat. There was no sword to draw if they fled. There was no harbor to which they could surrender. They were committed absolutely, irrevocably, and eternally to the advance. For 3 days and nights the fleet sailed through the outer dark, battling fierce crosswinds and towering swells. But unburdened by the parasitic weight of hesitation released from the exhausting mental gymnastics of whether they should turn back, the crews worked with a fierce, harmonious precision that defied human limits. They operated as a single sovereign organism. On the fourth morning, as the first golden rays of dawn pierced the maritime horizon, the mist parted to reveal an immense, breathtaking continent of lush, untouched green valleys, rising proudly against the morning sun, a new world, rich with infinite possibility, waiting entirely for the men who had refused to turn back. Leonidas stood at the bow, the sea spray cool upon his face, watching the new horizon rise to meet his ship. He did not smile with triumphant arrogance. He simply nodded with the quiet, sovereign dignity of a man who knew that destiny always belongs to those who dare to burn their ships. The lesson was forged in salt and sovereign will. He who burns his retreat owns the continent. How do you, the architect of your own destiny, translate this ultimate truth into the immediate, unyielding architecture of your existence right now? Stand at the threshold of your own life. Identify the final escape hatch you have secretly kept open, the backup plan, the comfortable excuse, the subtle hesitation that allows you to quit if the road gets too steep. Reach out your hand in your mind and with absolute, unhesitating resolve, weld that hatch shut. Burn your ships. Sever your ties to the comfort of mediocrity. Do not wait for a sign, a blessing, or a guarantee. Take the sovereign step across the final ridge today, throwing the full, unreserved weight of your being into the great work of your life. Anchor your ultimate resolve with the unbreakable affirmation that seals your destiny. I stand upon the sovereign decision. I burn my retreat, and I claim the horizon. Let those words ring like an imperial decree through the silent cathedral of your transformed consciousness. Feel the profound, electric stillness that follows the absolute silence of a mind completely united in purpose, stripped of fear, and utterly dedicated to the advance. You are no longer a wanderer lost in the fog. You are no longer a spectator waiting for permission from the world. You are the architect, the navigator, and the master of your own domain. The manuscript of your ascent is written. The night has been crossed. The dawn has broken. Step forward into your kingdom.